That's correct, Stephen, and we'll take good news at this point. It's a continuation in terms of the positivity that we're seeing in that BankservAfrica Economic Transaction Index. It's now reached its highest level in 8 months. That's sitting at 134.2 points for the month of April as the measure for all economic activity gains from recent recovery. This has been attributed to a number of factors, including an ease in load shedding, while spending in preparation for the upcoming elections might have also played a role. Economist Elize Kruger speaks to us about these developments. Good afternoon to you, Elize. Good to speak to you on this note. A welcomed reading. What does it represent in the overall picture of improving economic activity in South Africa?
Good afternoon, Tumisang. Yes, indeed, a positive number, and we are quite, excited to see that we've seen consecutive months now of positive, increase in the BETI, measuring the total value of economic transactions that pass through BankservAfrica as a clearinghouse. So it indeed, indicate to us that there's been some life in the economy, especially in April, the month where we zoomed into now. And, I do think it has a lot to do with the fact that we did not have any load shedding. That has had a positive impact. And then, as you alluded to, we also are thinking that the preparation spending for the upcoming elections could also have played a role.
That's quite interesting, the last part about preparation spending towards the elections. What are we seeing in terms of a trend there? And to what extent, Elize, does it speak to maybe sentiment among South African consumers, even though the economic climate is not at a positive level where spending is seen at an elevated stance? But what are we spending on and what are we preparing for, given that the election is towards the end of this month?
Yes, Tumisang, I did look back, since the inception of the BETI, basically since 2002, at all the elections, both national and municipal, and I looked at how the BETI performed the month before, the month of the election, and also afterwards. And what I found was that for 6 of the 9 elections I looked at, the month prior to the actual event, we saw heightened economic activity. And then also in the month where we are now in May, we should also see a blip in economic activity. So it's got to do, I think, a lot with what we see in terms of party activity. Some of the political parties, very busy with gatherings and advertising, marketing. And we've also got the Independent Electoral Commission that needs to prepare. And as you know, we've got a record number of people that are registered to vote. So to get all those voting stations ready, it's also a lot of additional spending that's going through the economy. And I do think we will see that reflected in retail sales mostly. So, yes, coming from maybe the sources of parties and overall institution. But I do think the fact that we have not seen load shedding also add a bit to the confidence levels of consumers. Yeah. And that could also have played a role.
Let's expand on the load shedding part. At this point, we welcome that there hasn't been the outages as frequently as we have been used to over the past decade or more. But Elize, it could come back at any given point. So does that not cause some sort of angst within the market to say this may be a momentary reaction?
So it feels like a bit too good to be true to not have had, load shedding for a prolonged, couple of weeks. But yes, I do think, we've spoken a lot about it, even in this program, how there have been a lot of investment into renewables, into solar and so on. So I think all of those things are starting to bear fruit. And, we always knew that it's difficult to time, but there might come a time when you suddenly realize the situation has alleviated due to the investments and the projects that have been in the pipeline. So I'm thinking we are starting to experience some of that, and I hope and I believe that it could be, more of a medium-term progress as opposed to a very short-term progress. So yes, I think that will add, and I think we have seen, especially in April now, given that we've had, really a month of no load shedding, we could suddenly see how economic activity spiked, and not only in the BankservAfrica index, the BETI, but if you also look at like the APSA PMI in manufacturing and the S&P Global, looking at the broader private sector even vehicle sales, had a positive flip in April. So I think, that whole notion that load shedding has really kept us back is just, in the evidence, one can see the opposite of that now.
On the back of that, the near-term outlook should then at least be more optimistic. We've been seeing this gradual improvement in economic transactions. Is it expected to continue?
Yes, indeed. I do think as a month in the month of May, so our next data release should also be a positive, given that we will have the election this month. So those additional spending activities are ongoing, and we have seen that in the 7 of the 8 months in which we had elections in the past, we had heightened economic activity. So I do think May will be a good number. That's our next release, and that will all build towards hopefully a better Q2 GDP growth numbers. So we are looking forward to some positive news in the next month or so.
Finally, the high inflation that remains, how much of a factor has that played within the economic transaction space?
So given that the beta is reported on in real terms, so the fact that we have seen inflation moderating somewhat, the beta deflator came down from like 5.6% to 5.3%. So that is a slight moderation. It did impact positively on the calculation of the beta.
Thank you so much, as always, for your input. That is Elize Kruger, independent analyst, talking to us about the latest BankservAfrica Economic Transaction Index, seeing yet another improvement, this time to an 8-month high.